The metal barrel felt cold against Sarah's temple as she stared into the captain's eyes, seeing something she had never witnessed before in her 15 years of military service. Genuine fear. Not fear of her, but fear of what he had just discovered about the quiet woman he had been tormenting for months. The same woman who had endured his verbal abuse, his impossible demands, and his constant attempts to break her spirit. The woman he thought was just another weak link in his command. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't just another soldier. She was a ghost, one of the military's most classified weapons, trained in shadows and silence, molded by years of operations that officially never existed. The captain had no idea that the person he had been pushing to her breaking point possessed skills that could end his life in 17 different ways before his finger could even twitch on that trigger. What happened next would change everything, not just for both of them, but for everyone who thought they understood the true meaning of strength, survival, and the deadly cost of underestimating a warrior who had learned to hide in plain sight. Sarah Mitchell had perfected the art of invisibility long before she learned to kill. Standing at 5 feet 4 inches with unremarkable brown hair and quiet hazel eyes, she moved through the world like smoke through water. Nobody looked twice at her. Nobody remembered her face after brief encounters. This gift of anonymity had served her well during her 8 years as a Navy SEAL, a classification so secret that even her personnel files listed her as a logistics coordinator. The morning that would change everything started like any other at Forward Operating Base Titan in Afghanistan. Sarah rolled out of her narrow bunk at 0430 hours, her body automatically shifting into the precise routine she had followed for 3,000 consecutive days. 50 push-ups, 50 sit-ups, a cold water rinse from the metal basin, and then the careful application of her mask, not the tactical gear kind, but the invisible one she wore to blend into the background of military life. Captain James Morrison had been commander of FOB Titan for 6 months, and in that time, he had developed a particular hatred for what he saw as weakness. At 38 years old, Morrison stood 6 feet 2 inches of pure military bearing, his jaw always set in a permanent scowl that had intimidated soldiers across 2 deployments. His philosophy was simple and brutal: break the weak ones early, and the strong ones would fall in line. Sarah had become his favorite target. It started with small things. Extra duty shifts when her rotation was supposed to be over. Menial tasks that kept her scrubbing latrines while other soldiers caught precious hours of sleep. Public humiliation during morning formations, where Morrison would single her out for uniform infractions that existed only in his imagination. The other soldiers watched these encounters with a mixture of pity and relief. Better her than them. What Captain Morrison failed to understand was that Sarah Mitchell had endured training that would have broken him in the first week. She had survived SERE School's psychological torture, learned to resist interrogation techniques designed by experts, and spent months in simulated captivity where sleep deprivation and mental abuse were just warm-up exercises. Morrison's amateur attempts at intimidation felt like gentle rain compared to the hurricanes she had weathered. But Sarah played her part perfectly. She flinched when he shouted. Her shoulders sagged under his criticism. Her voice trembled when forced to respond to his accusations. Every reaction was calculated, measured, designed to feed his ego while revealing nothing about who she really was beneath the surface. The other soldiers at FOB Titan saw exactly what Sarah wanted them to see: a quiet woman struggling to keep up, probably regretting her decision to join the military. They had no idea that 3 weeks earlier, she had single-handedly eliminated a high-value target in a compound 12 miles from their base. They didn't know that the successful raids they celebrated were often the direct result of intelligence she had gathered during solo operations that officially never happened. Specialist Rodriguez was one of the few who sensed something different about Sarah. A communications expert with 2 tours under his belt, Rodriguez had noticed small things that didn't quite fit. The way Sarah's eyes tracked movement even when she appeared to be staring at the ground. How she instinctively positioned herself near exits during briefings. The fact that she never seemed truly surprised by sudden loud noises that made other soldiers jump. There's something about Mitchell, Rodriguez confided to Sergeant Williams one evening as they cleaned their weapons. She's not what she appears to be. Williams, a career soldier with 15 years of experience, glanced toward the corner where Sarah sat alone, methodically cleaning her rifle with movements too precise for someone who was supposedly just a logistics coordinator. Maybe she's just good with weapons, he suggested, but his tone carried doubt. Nobody's that good without serious training, Rodriguez replied. Watch her sometime. Really watch. She moves like someone who's seen real action. What neither soldier could know was that Sarah had indeed seen action, the kind that remained classified decades after operations ended. She had been part of missions that shaped global politics from shadows. Her hands had taken lives in service of objectives that would never appear in history books. The woman they saw struggling under Morrison's abuse was really a weapon of extraordinary precision, temporarily hidden in a carefully constructed disguise. Morrison's campaign against Sarah escalated during the third week of October. A supply convoy had been hit by IEDs 20 miles south of the base, resulting in 3 wounded soldiers and a damaged vehicle. Morrison gathered his command staff for a briefing, but his attention quickly focused on finding someone to blame for what he perceived as intelligence failures. Mitchell, he barked, his voice carrying across the briefing tent. Stand up. Sarah rose slowly, her posture deliberately uncertain. Around the tent, 20 pairs of eyes focused on her, most filled with sympathy for whatever was about to happen. Explain to me how our intelligence was so far off the mark that our people drove straight into an ambush. Morrison demanded, his face reddening with anger that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Sarah had actually provided detailed warnings about that exact route 3 days earlier, information that Morrison had dismissed as unnecessary caution. Her real-time intelligence network, cultivated through contacts and methods that were far beyond anything a logistics coordinator should possess, had identified the threat clearly. But revealing this would mean exposing her true capabilities. Sir, I don't have access to intelligence briefings, Sarah replied, her voice carrying just the right amount of confusion and nervousness. Morrison stepped closer, invading her personal space in a classic intimidation tactic. Don't play dumb with me, soldier. Everyone here knows you've been asking questions, poking around in areas that aren't your concern. This was partially true. Sarah had been gathering information, but not in the clumsy, obvious way Morrison implied. Her intelligence gathering was so subtle that even trained counterintelligence officers would have struggled to detect it. She had cultivated sources, monitored communications, and built a comprehensive picture of enemy activity in their sector, all while maintaining her cover as someone barely competent enough to sort mail. I just want to do my job properly, sir, Sarah responded, allowing a slight tremor to enter her voice. Your job is to follow orders and stay in your lane, Morrison snarled. Not to play soldier, and certainly not to second-guess your commanding officer. The irony was suffocating. Morrison was lecturing one of the military's most accomplished operators about staying in her lane, while his own incompetence had nearly gotten soldiers killed. Sarah felt the familiar cold focus that came before action, the mental state she had learned to enter when violence became necessary. But this wasn't the time or place. Her mission required maintaining her cover, regardless of personal cost. Yes, sir, she replied, lowering her eyes in apparent submission. Morrison wasn't finished. Since you seem so interested in intelligence work, you could spend the next week pulling night watch duty while thinking about the difference between your fantasies and reality. Night watch meant 12-hour shifts in addition to regular duties, a punishment designed to break down physical and mental resilience. For a normal soldier, it was brutal but survivable. For Sarah, it was actually a blessing in disguise. Night hours gave her cover for the real work she needed to accomplish. As the briefing ended and soldiers filed out, Rodriguez caught Sarah's arm gently. You okay? Sarah looked up with eyes that appeared defeated but held depths Rodriguez couldn't quite understand. I'll be fine, she said. Always am. But Rodriguez noticed something in her tone. Not resignation, but something that sounded almost like anticipation. Over the next several days, Sarah executed her night watch duties while simultaneously conducting surveillance operations that would have impressed her former instructors. Using methods learned in the darkest corners of special operations training, she mapped enemy movement patterns, identified new threats, and tracked supply lines that regular intelligence had missed completely. Morrison, meanwhile, had begun to view his psychological campaign against Sarah as a personal mission. He started finding reasons to inspect her quarters, criticize her work performance in front of other soldiers, and assign her tasks specifically designed to humiliate. Each interaction fed his sense of power and control. What he couldn't see was that every humiliation Sarah endured was being carefully cataloged and stored away. Not for revenge, but as valuable information about Morrison's psychological profile, tactical thinking, and decision-making patterns. She was studying him the way a predator studies prey, noting weaknesses and vulnerabilities that could be exploited if necessary. The transformation was gradual, but unmistakable to those who knew how to look. Sarah's responses to Morrison's abuse became slightly more measured. Her movements, while still appearing nervous and uncertain, carried an underlying efficiency that spoke of serious training. The mask was beginning to slip, not from loss of control, but because maintaining it was becoming tactically unnecessary. Sergeant Williams was the first to voice what several soldiers were beginning to suspect. "There's something wrong with this picture," he told Rodriguez during a quiet moment in the motor pool. "Morrison's pushing Mitchell hard, but she's not breaking the way he expects." "What do you mean?" Rodriguez asked, though he had been thinking similar thoughts. "Watch her eyes," Williams replied. "When he's screaming at her, watch her eyes. They're not scared. They're calculating." The observation was more accurate than Williams realized. Behind her carefully maintained facade, Sarah was indeed calculating, measuring distances, noting Morrison's positioning, cataloging his habits and preferences. Not because she planned to act, but because assessment and preparation were so deeply ingrained in her nature that they had become automatic responses. The situation reached its first critical point on a Thursday morning when Morrison discovered that someone had been accessing secure communication channels during night watch hours. The unauthorized access wasn't malicious. Someone had been monitoring enemy communications and gathering intelligence that had prevented two potential attacks on supply convoys. But Morrison saw only the violation of protocol and the implied criticism of his leadership. He gathered his command staff and began a methodical investigation, interrogating each soldier who had access to the communications equipment. When he reached Sarah, his questions carried an edge of suspicion that suggested he had already decided she was responsible. "Mitchell, you've been pulling night watch all week," Morrison stated, his voice carrying the tone of someone building a case. "During that time, someone has been using equipment they weren't authorized to touch." Sarah maintained her nervous demeanor, but inside she was rapidly calculating options and consequences. The intelligence she had gathered could save lives, but revealing her capabilities would compromise years of careful cover building. The mission parameters were clear: maintain cover at all costs. "Sir, I wouldn't know how to operate that equipment properly," she replied, which was technically true. She wouldn't operate it properly. Her methods were far more sophisticated than anything the regular communications protocols allowed. Morrison stepped closer, and for the first time, Sarah detected something dangerous in his approach. This wasn't just harassment or power games anymore. He was genuinely suspicious, and suspicious commanding officers could become serious threats to operational security. "I think you're lying," Morrison said quietly. "I think you know exactly how to operate that equipment, and I think you've been conducting unauthorized activities that could compromise this entire base." The accusation was serious enough to trigger a formal investigation, which would mean scrutiny that Sarah's cover identity couldn't withstand. For the first time since arriving at FOB Titan, she felt the cold touch of real danger, not to her life, but to her mission and the larger operations that depended on her maintaining this position. "Sir, I swear I don't know anything about unauthorized communications," Sarah replied, but she could see in Morrison's eyes that he wasn't convinced. What happened next would set in motion the events that would bring everything into the open, forcing both Sarah and Morrison to confront truths that would change everything they thought they knew about power, control, and the real nature of the person Morrison had been trying so hard to break. The storm was building, and neither of them fully understood just how dangerous things were about to become. Morrison's investigation into the unauthorized communications became an obsession that consumed the next week of operations at FOB Titan. He instituted new security protocols, restricted access to sensitive equipment, and began conducting surprise inspections at random hours. The entire base felt the pressure of his increasing paranoia, but his focus remained fixed on Sarah Mitchell. What Morrison didn't realize was that his heightened security measures were actually making Sarah's real job easier. As a trained operative, she had learned to work within heavily monitored environments where every action was scrutinized. The additional protocols forced her to be more creative, but they also provided perfect cover for activities that would have seemed suspicious under normal circumstances. The irony was that Morrison's suspicions were completely accurate. Sarah was indeed responsible for the unauthorized communications. But his understanding of what that meant was so far from reality that he might as well have been investigating a completely different person. He imagined a soldier overstepping boundaries, perhaps trying to impress superiors or gain access to classified information for personal reasons. The possibility that he was dealing with an operator whose clearance level was so high it didn't officially exist never entered his mind. Sarah used the increased scrutiny to her advantage, allowing Morrison to catch her in minor infractions that reinforced his image of her as someone trying too hard and failing consistently. She left equipment slightly out of place, submitted reports with minor formatting errors, and maintained just enough nervous energy during inspections to satisfy his need to feel superior while never giving him concrete evidence of serious wrongdoing. But the psychological pressure was building on both sides. Morrison felt his authority being challenged by someone he viewed as beneath him, which triggered responses that went beyond professional discipline into personal territory. Sarah, meanwhile, was walking an increasingly narrow line between maintaining her cover and completing mission objectives that were becoming more critical as enemy activity in the region intensified. The situation came to a head on a Tuesday evening when intelligence reports indicated a major enemy operation was being planned for the following week. Sarah's network of sources had provided detailed information about the threat, including specific timing, targets, and methods that could save dozens of American lives. But passing this information through proper channels would require revelations about capabilities and access that would destroy her cover permanently. She made the calculated decision to act independently, using her night watch access to gather additional intelligence and take preventive action. The operation required her to leave the base perimeter, infiltrate an enemy position 3 miles away, and neutralize a communications hub that was coordinating the planned attacks. It was exactly the kind of mission Sarah had been trained for, but conducting it while maintaining her cover as a logistics coordinator required extraordinary careful planning. She would need to complete the operation and return to base without leaving any trace of her absence, while ensuring that the enemy communications disruption looked like equipment failure rather than sabotage. The mission itself went flawlessly. Sarah moved through the darkness with the efficiency of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of invisible warfare. She bypassed enemy sentries using techniques that turned their own security protocols against them, reached the communications hub undetected, and disabled it using methods that would puzzle enemy technicians for weeks. But perfection in execution couldn't account for Morrison's growing obsession with monitoring her activities. When Sarah returned to base at 0347 hours, she found Morrison waiting in the communications tent with 2 military police officers and a portable lie detector system he had requisitioned from the main command base 50 miles away. Specialist Mitchell, Morrison said, his voice carrying a satisfaction that made Sarah's tactical instincts immediately shift to high alert. We need to have a conversation. The next few hours would test every aspect of Sarah's training in ways her instructors had never anticipated. Morrison had convinced himself that she was either a spy or someone conducting unauthorized operations that threatened base security. He was determined to break her down psychologically until she confessed to whatever he believed she was hiding. The interrogation began formally, but quickly became personal. Morrison dismissed the military police officers and connected the polygraph equipment himself, clearly intending to conduct the session without official oversight. This violation of proper procedure should have been Sarah's first warning that Morrison was operating outside normal military discipline. "I know you've been leaving the base at night," Morrison began, though his evidence was entirely circumstantial. "I know you've been accessing equipment and information beyond your clearance level. What I want to know is who you're working for and what kind of information you've been passing." Sarah had undergone polygraph resistance training that was so classified that the techniques themselves were considered state secrets. She could control her physiological responses well enough to render the machine useless, but doing so too obviously would confirm Morrison's suspicions. Instead, she allowed the device to register stress responses that were consistent with an innocent person being falsely accused. "Sir, I haven't left the base except for authorized duties," she replied, which was technically true since her mission had been authorized, just not by anyone Morrison would recognize as having that authority. Morrison studied the polygraph readings with the intensity of someone who believed he was uncovering a major conspiracy. What he saw was exactly what Sarah intended: the stress patterns of someone telling the truth while being under extreme pressure. "These readings don't match someone who's being honest," Morrison declared, though his interpretation of the data was completely wrong. "I think you're trained to beat polygraph tests, which means you're not who you claim to be." This was the closest Morrison had come to the actual truth, but his conclusion was still so far off target that it actually helped Sarah maintain her cover. He suspected her of being a foreign operative or perhaps a journalist gathering information for an unauthorized story. The possibility that she was an American special operations asset was beyond his ability to imagine. The interrogation continued for 3 hours, with Morrison becoming increasingly aggressive as his techniques failed to produce the confession he expected. He had moved far beyond proper military procedure into territory that bordered on psychological abuse, but Sarah had endured real torture from experts who made Morrison look like an amateur. What Morrison couldn't see was that every question he asked was being evaluated and cataloged by someone whose training in human psychology exceeded his own by several orders of magnitude. Sarah was learning more about Morrison's mental state, tactical thinking, and personal motivations than he was learning about her. The breaking point came when Morrison shifted tactics and began making threats about what would happen to her family if she didn't cooperate. This crossed a line that even Sarah's mission parameters couldn't ignore. Threatening family members was a technique used by enemy interrogators, not American officers questioning their own soldiers. "My daughter's only 8 years old," Morrison said, apparently believing that Sarah had children based on incorrect assumptions in her cover identity. It would be terrible if her mother's military career ended in disgrace because she couldn't tell the truth about simple questions. Sarah felt the cold focus that preceded violence, the mental state she entered when someone crossed from being a complication into being a genuine threat. But she maintained her external appearance of fear while internally shifting into tactical assessment mode. Morrison had just revealed that he was willing to threaten perceived family members to achieve his objectives. This indicated a level of psychological instability that made him genuinely dangerous, not just to Sarah's mission, but to the safety of everyone under his command. The calculation was simple. Morrison had moved from being someone to avoid into someone who needed to be neutralized. But neutralizing a commanding officer required extreme care and perfect timing. Sarah would need to create a situation where Morrison's removal appeared to be the result of his own actions rather than anything she had engineered. The opportunity came sooner than expected. After the failed interrogation, Morrison's behavior toward the entire base command became increasingly erratic. He began making decisions that put soldiers at risk, countermanding orders from higher command, and showing signs of paranoid thinking that extended far beyond his obsession with Sarah. Sergeant Williams was the first to formally express concern about Morrison's fitness for command. After Morrison ordered a patrol into territory that intelligence had clearly identified as compromised, Williams requested a private meeting with the base's senior non-commissioned officer. "Sir, I'm concerned that Captain Morrison is making decisions based on personal issues rather than tactical considerations," Williams said carefully. "His judgment seems compromised." The observation was accurate, but Williams had no way of knowing that Morrison's deteriorating mental state was the direct result of his encounters with someone whose psychological training far exceeded his ability to understand or counter. Sarah had been using subtle techniques to amplify Morrison's existing paranoid tendencies, not through direct manipulation, but by being exactly the kind of enigma that would drive someone with his personality profile toward increasingly irrational behavior. Every carefully measured response to his accusations, every small inconsistency in her cover story, every moment when she seemed to know slightly more than she should have, all of it was designed to feed his suspicions while providing no concrete evidence he could act upon. The technique was incredibly dangerous because it relied on Morrison's psychological destruction rather than direct confrontation. But it was also the only method that would allow Sarah to neutralize him without compromising her mission or revealing her true capabilities. The final phase began when Morrison decided to conduct one more interrogation, this time using methods that abandoned any pretense of following military regulations. He had convinced himself that Sarah was the key to a conspiracy that threatened everything he believed about his own competence and authority. But this time, Sarah was ready to let him discover exactly who he had really been challenging for the past month. The revelation would destroy him psychologically while appearing to be entirely the result of his own investigative efforts. Morrison had no idea that the woman he was about to confront one final time was about to show him the true meaning of being completely outmatched by someone operating on a level he couldn't even comprehend. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything, and neither of them would emerge from it unchanged. The confrontation that would change everything began at 2,347 hours on a Thursday night when Morrison decided to conduct what he called a final resolution of the Sarah Mitchell situation. He had spent the previous day reviewing intelligence reports and had discovered something that sent his paranoid suspicions into overdrive. The unauthorized communications activities had actually prevented 3 separate attacks on American forces, showing a level of tactical sophistication that was impossible for a simple logistics coordinator to possess. Rather than recognizing this as evidence that Sarah was working to protect American lives, Morrison's distorted thinking led him to conclude that she must be part of an elaborate enemy operation designed to infiltrate American forces from within. In his mind, preventing attacks was actually a way of building credibility before conducting a larger, more devastating operation. Sarah knew the confrontation was coming. Her surveillance of Morrison's behavior patterns had revealed the telltale signs of someone building toward a decisive action. He had been isolating himself from other officers, reviewing personnel files obsessively, and showing physical symptoms of extreme stress that indicated he was preparing for something he viewed as critically important. What Morrison didn't realize was that Sarah had been preparing for this moment as well, but with the kind of methodical precision that came from years of planning operations where failure meant death. Every detail of the coming encounter had been war-gamed in her mind dozens of times, with contingencies prepared for every possible direction the situation might take. Morrison chose the base's interrogation facility for their final confrontation, a soundproof room normally used for questioning captured enemy personnel. The selection of location told Sarah everything she needed to know about Morrison's mental state. He no longer saw her as an American soldier under his command, but as an enemy operative who needed to be broken using any means necessary. He had also made a decision that crossed the final line between military discipline and criminal behavior. Instead of following proper procedure for suspected security breaches, Morrison had decided to handle the situation himself using methods that were not only unauthorized, but actively forbidden under military law. When Sarah entered the interrogation room at Morrison's order, she immediately cataloged every detail that would matter in the next few minutes. The room's dimensions, lighting, exit options, Morrison's positioning, the placement of furniture, and, most importantly, the service pistol Morrison had placed on the table in clear violation of every protocol for conducting interviews with suspected security risks. "Sit down, Mitchell," Morrison commanded, his voice carrying a tone Sarah recognized from her training as indicating someone who had moved beyond rational thinking into a state where violence was not only possible, but likely. Sarah took the indicated chair, maintaining her nervous demeanor while internally shifting into the hyper-alert state she had learned to enter when situations became potentially lethal. Every muscle in her body remained outwardly relaxed while becoming ready for explosive action that could move her from apparent helplessness to complete control in less than 2 seconds. "I know what you are," Morrison began, his eyes showing the kind of fixed intensity that indicated complete certainty regardless of evidence. "I know you're not really Sarah Mitchell, logistics coordinator. I know you're here as part of some operation that threatens the security of this base and every soldier under my command." The accusation was so close to the truth and yet so completely wrong that Sarah almost found it amusing. She was indeed not really Sarah Mitchell, and she was absolutely part of an operation, but an American operation designed to protect exactly the soldiers Morrison claimed to be defending. "Sir, I don't understand what you're suggesting," Sarah replied, allowing genuine confusion to show in her voice, because she truly was confused about how Morrison's mind had reached its current conclusions. Morrison stood and began pacing a movement pattern that brought him closer to the pistol with each circuit. "The communications you've been conducting, the intelligence you somehow possess about enemy activities, the way you seem to anticipate threats before they develop. None of that is possible for someone with your supposed background and training." Everything Morrison had observed was accurate, but his interpretation revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how special operations actually functioned. He had noticed all the right details, but reached completely wrong conclusions because his experience base had no frame of reference for what he was actually dealing with. "I've been trying to do my job the best I can," Sarah said, which was entirely true. "If I made mistakes or overstepped, I apologize." Morrison's response revealed just how far he had moved beyond rational military leadership. "Mistakes," he said, his voice rising. "You think preventing 3 major attacks on American forces was a mistake? You think demonstrating tactical knowledge that exceeds that of our intelligence specialists was an accident?" The questions revealed that Morrison had actually conducted a sophisticated analysis of Sarah's activities over the past month. His conclusions might have been wrong, but his observational skills were better than she had given him credit for. This made him significantly more dangerous than she had initially assessed. "I don't know anything about preventing attacks," Sarah replied, maintaining her cover while mentally preparing for the moment when maintaining it would become impossible. Morrison stopped pacing and fixed her with a stare that carried genuine hatred. "I'm going to give you one last chance to tell me the truth about who you really are and what you're really doing here. After that, I'm going to use methods that will get me the answers I need regardless of what you want to tell me." The threat was clear and represented a complete abandonment of military law. Morrison was announcing his intention to torture an American soldier under his command to extract information he believed she possessed. This crossed every possible line that separated military discipline from war crimes. Sarah felt the familiar cold focus that preceded violence, but she also recognized that Morrison had just given her exactly the opening she needed to reveal her true nature without compromising her larger mission objectives. His threats had moved him from being a complication to being an active threat to national security. "Captain Morrison," Sarah said, her voice taking on a tone that carried subtle changes he was too agitated to notice, "I think there's been a serious misunderstanding. Morrison picked up his service pistol and checked the magazine, actions that demonstrated he had moved beyond threats into actual preparation for violence. The only misunderstanding is your belief that I'm going to continue tolerating lies from someone who is clearly operating under false pretenses. What happened next took place in a span of perhaps 15 seconds, but those seconds would reshape both their understanding of power, capability, and the nature of the person Morrison had been systematically underestimating for weeks. Sarah made a decision that her training had prepared her for, but that she had hoped would never become necessary. Morrison's behavior had reached a point where continued deception was more dangerous than revelation, both for her mission and for the safety of the soldiers under his increasingly unstable command. "Captain," she said, rising from her chair with movements that were no longer nervous or uncertain, "I need you to put the weapon down and listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." Morrison's response was to raise the pistol and point it directly at her head, his finger moving to the trigger with the kind of determination that indicated he was beyond rational negotiation. "Sit down and start talking, or I'm going to start asking questions in ways that will guarantee answers." The moment stretched between them like a held breath, with Morrison convinced he had finally gained control of the situation and Sarah calculating the exact sequence of movements that would disarm him without causing permanent injury. Neither of them fully understood that what happened next would change everything they thought they knew about strength, training, and the real nature of the person Morrison had been trying so hard to break. Morrison's finger began to tighten on the trigger, and Sarah's training took over with the kind of automatic precision that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of practice in scenarios exactly like this one. But instead of immediately disarming him, Sarah made a choice that would prove more devastating to Morrison than any physical action could have been. She decided to tell him exactly who he was really dealing with, knowing that the truth would destroy his mental framework more completely than any demonstration of physical capability. "My name isn't Sarah Mitchell," she said quietly, her voice carrying a calm authority that cut through Morrison's agitation like a blade. "My real name is classified at a level you don't have access to, and I'm here as part of an operation you're not clear to know about." Morrison's hand began to shake slightly, not from fear, but from the cognitive dissonance of hearing words that didn't match his expectations of how someone with a gun to their head should respond. "I'm going to say this once," Sarah continued, her tone becoming something Morrison had never heard before, the voice of someone accustomed to absolute authority in life or death situations. "You're going to put that weapon down, and then I'm going to show you exactly why threatening me was the biggest mistake you've ever made in your military career." Morrison's world was about to shatter in ways he couldn't possibly anticipate, and the woman he had been tormenting for months was about to reveal herself as something far beyond his ability to understand or control. The gun remained pointed at her head, but everything else was about to change forever. Morrison's finger was still on the trigger when Sarah moved, but the action that followed wasn't the explosive violence he might have expected from someone finally revealing their true capabilities. Instead, Sarah did something that demonstrated a level of confidence that completely shattered Morrison's understanding of their power dynamic. She reached in her pocket with deliberate, unhurried movements while maintaining direct eye contact with him. "If you pull that trigger," Sarah said with the kind of calm certainty that comes from absolute knowledge, "you'll be dead before your finger finishes the motion. But I don't want to kill you, Captain. I want you to understand exactly what you've been dealing with for the past month." Morrison's training told him to react to her movement, to shout commands, to assert control through violence if necessary. But something in Sarah's tone, the complete lack of fear in someone who had a loaded weapon pointed at their head, created a moment of hesitation that would prove fatal to everything he thought he knew about the situation. Sarah withdrew a small device that looked like a standard military communication unit, but carried design features Morrison didn't recognize. She pressed a sequence of buttons with movements that spoke of absolute familiarity with equipment far beyond anything a logistics coordinator should have access to. "Alpha 70 to control," Sarah spoke into the device, her voice carrying codes, and terminology that Morrison recognized as belonging to classification levels he had only heard referenced in classified briefings. Requesting immediate authentication protocol for Operation Ghostwalker. Priority 1. The response came through speakers that were somehow audible to Morrison despite the device's small size. The voice was crisp, professional, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone operating from a command level far above anything at FOB Titan. Alpha 70. Authentication confirmed. Operational parameters remain in effect. Report status. Morrison felt his world beginning to shift as he realized he was listening to communications that operated on channels he didn't even know existed. The codes, the terminology, the casual references to operations that weren't part of any briefings he had received, all of it pointed to realities that his military experience had no framework for understanding. Control, operational security has been compromised by base commander's investigation. Request authorization for full revelation protocols. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but felt much longer to Morrison, whose mind was racing to process implications that kept expanding beyond his ability to contain them. Alpha 70. Revelation protocols authorized. Secure the situation and maintain mission parameters. Sarah returned the communication device to her pocket and looked at Morrison with eyes that no longer held any pretense of nervousness or uncertainty. What he saw instead was something that made his hand begin to shake for reasons that had nothing to do with the weight of the weapon. Captain Morrison, Sarah said, her voice carrying an authority that made it clear their roles had reversed completely. You are currently pointing a weapon at a United States Navy SEAL operating under classified orders that supersede your command authority. The person you've been harassing for the past month is responsible for preventing 17 separate attacks on American forces in this sector, including 3 operations that would have resulted in casualties at this base. Morrison's mind struggled to process information that contradicted everything he believed he understood about military hierarchies, operational structures, and his own position in the chain of command. The woman he had been systematically humiliating was claiming to outrank him not just in terms of authority, but in terms of capabilities that existed at classification levels he had never been cleared to access. That's impossible, Morrison said, though his voice carried none of the confidence he had displayed minutes earlier. Your logistics. I've seen your file. Sarah's smile held no warmth, only the kind of professional satisfaction that comes from finally being able to reveal a truth that had been carefully hidden. You've seen the cover identity file. My real file is classified at levels that require presidential authorization to access. The person you've been investigating doesn't exist. The person standing in front of you has been conducting operations in this region for 8 months, and your harassment has been noted as a security risk by people whose names you will never learn. Morrison felt the pistol becoming heavier in his hand as he realized that pointing a weapon at Sarah was no longer a demonstration of his power, but evidence of his complete lack of understanding about who held real authority in this situation. But his ego and months of building toward this confrontation made it impossible for him to simply lower the weapon and accept that his entire worldview had been wrong. Prove it, Morrison demanded, though his voice now carried desperation rather than command authority. If you're really what you claim to be, prove it. Sarah's response was to demonstrate capabilities that Morrison's military training had no reference point for understanding. Moving with speed that seemed to violate the laws of physics, she disarmed Morrison so quickly that he didn't realize the weapon was no longer in his hand until he found himself face down on the interrogation table with his arm twisted behind his back in a position that sent white-hot pain through his shoulder. The entire sequence had taken less than 2 seconds, and Morrison had seen almost none of it. One moment he had been holding a pistol pointed at Sarah's head, and the next moment he was completely immobilized by someone whose strength and skill were so far beyond his experience that he couldn't even understand what had happened to him. That was basic disarmament, Sarah said conversationally, maintaining the pressure on Morrison's arm with precisely the amount of force needed to keep him immobilized without causing permanent injury. I could have killed you in 47 different ways during the time it took to do that, but my orders are to maintain operational security while minimizing casualties among American personnel. Morrison tried to speak, but found that his position made breathing difficult enough that forming words required more effort than he could manage. Sarah adjusted her hold slightly, relieving the pressure just enough to allow him to function while maintaining complete control. For the past month, you've been conducting psychological warfare against someone trained to resist interrogation techniques that would break most people in the first hour, Sarah continued, her tone remaining professionally detached. Every response I gave you was calculated to feed your ego while preventing you from discovering information that could compromise operations affecting national security. The revelation was devastating not just because of what it meant about Sarah's capabilities, but because of what it revealed about Morrison's complete failure to recognize what he was dealing with. Every moment when he had felt successful in intimidating her, every time he had believed he was breaking down her psychological defenses, every instance when he had congratulated himself on his superior understanding of human nature, all of it had been carefully orchestrated by someone operating at a level of sophistication he couldn't even begin to comprehend. "You think you were investigating security breaches," Sarah said, adjusting her position to ensure Morrison couldn't move without causing himself significant pain. "You were actually interfering with operations that have prevented casualties among the soldiers you claim to be protecting. The unauthorized communications you detected were part of an intelligence network that has saved more American lives in the past month than your entire command has protected in your complete military career." Morrison felt something breaking inside his chest that had nothing to do with physical pain. The psychological foundation of everything he had believed about his own competence, his authority, and his understanding of military operations was collapsing under the weight of revelations that redefined his entire experience of the past month. Sarah released him and stepped back, but Morrison remained motionless on the table because the psychological shock of what he had learned was more immobilizing than any physical restraint could have been. "Get up, Captain," Sarah commanded, and Morrison realized that the authority in her voice was something he had never possessed himself. This was the sound of someone accustomed to giving orders in situations where lives depended on instant obedience, where questioning commands meant death for entire teams of operators. Morrison struggled to his feet, his body shaking not from physical trauma, but from the complete reorganization his understanding of reality was undergoing. Sarah picked up his service pistol and ejected the magazine with movements that spoke of absolute familiarity with weapons far more sophisticated than standard military issue. "This conversation never happened," Sarah said, her tone making it clear this was not a request, but an operational directive. "You will submit a report stating that your investigation into communications irregularities revealed no evidence of security breaches. You will recommend that Specialist Mitchell be commended for exemplary performance under difficult conditions." Morrison stared at her with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had been destroyed and rebuilt in the space of 15 minutes. "What happens now?" Sarah's smile was cold and professional. "Now you return to your duties as base commander with the understanding that there are operations taking place in your sector that are far beyond your clearance level or operational authority. You will continue to command your soldiers competently and professionally, and you will never again interfere with activities you don't understand." Morrison nodded automatically, but Sarah wasn't finished delivering truth that would reshape his understanding of military service forever. "And Captain," Sarah added, her voice carrying a finality that made it clear this was the last time they would have this kind of conversation, "the next time you point a weapon at someone, you should be absolutely certain they're not capable of taking it away from you and using it more effectively than you ever could." Morrison left the interrogation room a completely different person than the one who had entered it, carrying knowledge that would haunt his dreams and reshape every decision he would make for the rest of his military career. Behind him, Sarah Mitchell, or whoever she really was, returned to being invisible once again. But Morrison would never again be able to look at her without seeing the predator that had been hiding behind carefully constructed vulnerability. The base continued operating normally, but Morrison's understanding of what normal meant had been permanently altered by 15 minutes with someone who existed at levels of military capability he had never imagined were possible. The change in Captain Morrison was immediate and unmistakable to everyone who interacted with him in the days following his confrontation with Sarah. The man who had ruled FOB Titan through intimidation and psychological pressure had been replaced by someone who seemed to move through his duties with the careful precision of someone who had learned exactly how much he didn't understand about the world around him. Sarah returned to her cover identity with the same methodical attention to detail that had sustained her for months, but now there was an additional layer of complexity to manage. Morrison knew her secret, which created both opportunities and dangers that required constant evaluation and adjustment. The morning after their confrontation, Morrison conducted his first formation since learning the truth about Sarah Mitchell. As soldiers assembled for daily briefings and duty assignments, his behavior displayed subtle but significant changes that the more observant personnel noticed immediately. Sergeant Williams, who had been growing increasingly concerned about Morrison's mental state, was relieved to see what appeared to be a return to professional military bearing. Morrison's orders were clear and appropriate. His demeanor was controlled, and he showed none of the paranoid agitation that had characterized his recent behavior. But Williams also noticed that Morrison's eyes never quite settled on Sarah during the formation, as if he was deliberately avoiding direct contact with someone who now represented something beyond his ability to categorize or control. Sarah, for her part, continued playing her role perfectly. She maintained the nervous, uncertain demeanor that had served her cover so well, but there were microscopic adjustments visible only to someone who knew what to look for. Her posture carried a barely detectable increase in confidence, and her responses to Morrison's orders held a subtle quality that suggested respect between professional equals rather than fear from subordinate to superior. Specialist Rodriguez, whose instincts about Sarah had been proven more accurate than he realized, noticed these changes during their first shift together after what other soldiers assumed had been just another of Morrison's disciplinary sessions. "You seem different today, Mitchell," Rodriguez observed as they worked through routine equipment maintenance. "More relaxed or something." Sarah looked up with the same quiet expression she had always maintained, but Rodriguez caught something in her eyes that suggested depths he was only beginning to understand. "I guess I'm finally getting used to how things work around here," she replied. The statement was true in ways Rodriguez couldn't possibly comprehend. Sarah had indeed learned how things worked. She had discovered exactly how to manage Morrison's psychological profile, neutralize his threat to operational security, and maintain her mission parameters while revealing just enough truth to ensure future cooperation. Over the following week, Morrison's command style underwent a complete transformation. The arbitrary punishments ceased, the psychological pressure campaigns ended, and his interactions with all personnel became characterized by professional respect rather than dominance games. The change was so dramatic that senior personnel began commenting on Morrison's improved leadership capabilities. What none of them understood was that Morrison had learned a lesson about power that would reshape his approach to military service forever. He had discovered that real authority came not from the ability to intimidate subordinates, but from understanding one's own limitations and respecting capabilities that operated beyond one's own experience. The transformation was most visible in Morrison's interactions with Sarah. Where previously he had sought opportunities to assert dominance through criticism and humiliation, he now treated her with careful professional courtesy that bordered on deference. He never again questioned her duty assignments, challenged her competence, or subjected her to the kind of harassment that had characterized their previous relationship. Sarah used this change to her advantage, gradually expanding her operational activities while maintaining the appearance of simple logistics coordination. With Morrison no longer actively interfering with her work, she could conduct the intelligence gathering and threat assessment activities that were her primary mission without the constant need to deflect suspicious attention. The results were measurable in ways that appeared in no official reports, but saved lives on a regular basis. Enemy operations that would have cost American casualties were disrupted before they could be implemented. Supply convoys traveled safely through routes that Sarah's intelligence network had cleared of threats. Patrol schedules were adjusted based on information that prevented soldiers from walking into ambushes. All of this happened invisibly, with credit appearing to go to improved coordination between units, better intelligence from higher command, and Morrison's enhanced leadership capabilities. Sarah's actual contributions remained as hidden as they had always been, but now she could make them without interference from someone whose ego had previously made him a threat to operational effectiveness. The psychological impact on Morrison, however, continued to develop in ways that went far beyond simple professional courtesy. Having his entire understanding of military hierarchy and personal competence shattered, and rebuild had created a period of deep introspection about what military service actually meant and what kinds of people were really responsible for keeping soldiers alive in combat zones. Morrison began reading classified briefings with new understanding of how little he actually knew about the operations taking place in his sector. References to special assets and compartmentalized activities that he had previously ignored as bureaucratic language now carried implications that kept him awake at night thinking about what kinds of people might be operating under his nose without his knowledge or approval. The realization that Sarah Mitchell was almost certainly not the only person at FOB Titan whose true identity and capabilities were hidden from him created a permanent sense of humility that affected every decision he made as a commander. He began treating all personnel with increased respect, understanding that anyone under his command might possess knowledge, training, or authority that exceeded his own. 3 weeks after their confrontation, Morrison made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. During a video conference with Regional Command, he recommended that FOB Titan be designated as a support facility for special operations activities, without specifying what those activities might involve. The recommendation was approved without discussion, suggesting to Morrison that higher command had been waiting for him to reach this understanding on his own. The fact that his request was granted so easily confirmed his growing suspicion that activities had been taking place in his sector all along, with his ignorance being the primary limitation on their effectiveness. Sarah received notification of the designation change through communication channels Morrison didn't even know existed. The change would allow her to operate with greater freedom while maintaining the same level of security, but, more importantly, it represented Morrison's complete psychological capitulation to realities he was only beginning to understand. But the most significant change was in Morrison's understanding of what strength actually meant in military contexts. For his entire career, he had believed that power came from the ability to impose one's will through force, intimidation, or superior position in official hierarchies. His encounter with Sarah had taught him that real strength often operated invisibly, that the most dangerous people were often those who appeared most vulnerable, and that true military effectiveness came from capabilities that were so classified that acknowledging them was itself a security risk. The lesson had cost him his sense of certainty about his own competence, but it had also made him a more effective commander than he had ever been before. Soldiers under his command began performing better because they were no longer operating under constant psychological pressure. Mission success rates improved because Morrison was no longer interfering with activities he didn't understand. Morale increased because leadership had shifted from dominance-based control to professional respect. Sarah continued her work with the kind of invisible efficiency that had always characterized her operations, but now she could do so with the knowledge that the primary threat to her mission security had been neutralized not through violence, but through education. Morrison's discovery of her true nature had actually improved operational conditions by removing the need to constantly deflect and misdirect his suspicions. 6 months later, Morrison submitted a report to Regional Command recommending that Specialist Mitchell be considered for advanced training opportunities based on her exceptional performance under difficult conditions. The recommendation was noted and filed without response, but Morrison had learned enough about how special operations function to understand that Sarah's career development was being managed by people whose authority exceeded anything in his chain of command. The story of Captain Morrison and Sarah Mitchell became a case study in military psychology courses that discuss the importance of understanding operational complexity in modern warfare. The specific details remain classified, but the general lessons about leadership, humility, and the danger of underestimating personnel based on apparent capabilities became part of training curricula for commanding officers throughout the military. Morrison finished his deployment at FOB Titan as a completely different leader than the one who had arrived 6 months earlier. He never again made the mistake of assuming that people were exactly what they appear to be, and he never forgot the lesson about what happened when someone without adequate training attempted to challenge someone whose capabilities operated at levels they couldn't even imagine. Sarah Mitchell completed her mission with commendations that appeared in no public records, but were noted by people whose approval mattered more than any medal could. She moved on to other assignments, other cover identities, other operations that would remain invisible to everyone except those with the highest levels of security clearance. But the 15 minutes when she had been forced to reveal her true nature to Captain Morrison had changed both of their lives forever, proving that sometimes the most important lessons come not from success, but from the moment when someone realizes exactly how much they never understood about the people around them.